Hello everyone, I'm Creepy Raindrops and I'm here to assist you today. I know many of you use this video to unwind and fall asleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Get cozy, relax, and let yourself drift into calm. I work the night shift at a motel. The guests aren't all human, asterisk, asterisk. It all began on a chilly October evening in 2023. My name is Ethan Carter, and I've worked the graveyard shift at the old Pinecrest Motel in Montana for nearly 5 years. Nestled along a desolate highway surrounded by towering pine trees, the motel had its fair share of odd guests, but none prepared me for what was about to unfold. The clock on the lobby wall read 11:47 p.m., and the fluorescent light above the counter flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The night was eerily quiet. Too quiet, save for the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. A faint mist had begun to creep in, obscuring the view of the parking lot from the window behind my desk. It was a slow night. Only 3 of our 20 rooms were occupied. Room 4 by a middle-aged trucker named Bill, Room 8 by an elderly couple passing through to Oregon, and Room 13, a room I rarely rented out, by someone who had checked in earlier that evening. The man in Room 13 had a deep, gravelly voice and paid in cash. He gave no name, only a cold stare as he slid the money across the counter. I leaned back in the creaky office chair, scrolling absent-mindedly through my phone to pass the time, when I heard it, the faint jingle of the bell above the front door. I looked up, startled, but the door was shut, and no one was there. The mist outside seemed thicker now, almost alive as it swirled under the dim glow of the parking lot lights. Shrugging it off as my imagination, I returned to my phone, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. That's when the sound came again, this time louder. The bell jingled, followed by the unmistakable creak of the door opening. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No response. I stood up, my heartbeat quickening, and walked around the counter to check. The door was open just a crack, but there was no sign of anyone outside. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting at my skin. The mist was so thick now that I could barely see a few feet ahead. The only sound was the soft hum of the motel's neon sign buzzing above me. As I turned to go back inside, I noticed something on the ground, a wet footprint. It wasn't the shape of a shoe, though. It was elongated, almost claw-like, and trailed off toward the parking lot. I hesitated for a moment, then quickly stepped back into the safety of the lobby, locking the door behind me. I tried to shake the unease settling in my chest, telling myself it was probably just a raccoon or some other animal. But deep down, I knew better. The phone on the counter rang suddenly, breaking the silence. I jumped, nearly knocking over the coffee mug next to me. Composing myself, I answered. "Pinecrest Motel, Ethan speaking," I said, my voice trembling slightly. There was a pause, and then a whisper, so soft I could barely hear it. "Don't go to room 13. My blood ran cold. "Hello? Who is this?" I demanded, but the line went dead. I hung up, my hands shaking. My mind raced. Was this a prank? Maybe the trucker or the old couple had a twisted sense of humor. I wanted to believe that, but something in the voice told me otherwise. It was raspy and human. I glanced at the monitor displaying the security cameras. The feed flickered, static, cutting through the image, but I could make out the hallway outside room 13. The door was slightly ajar. It wasn't ajar when I checked earlier. "God damn it," I muttered under my breath. My gut screamed at me to stay put, to call the police, but curiosity, or stupidity, got the better of me. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk drawer and headed toward the hallway. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally in the narrow corridor. When I reached room 13, the door creaked open wider, as if inviting me inside. What I saw inside froze me in my tracks. The room was bathed in an unnatural, pale light that seemed to have no source. The old-fashioned lamp on the nightstand flickered on and off, but it wasn't the cause of the glow. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the temperature had dropped drastically. My breath puffed out in small white clouds, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight. The bed was untouched, the covers neatly tucked, as I'd left them when I checked the room earlier. But the window, facing the dense forest behind the motel, was wide open, its curtains fluttering violently despite the stillness outside. And then I noticed something else. Scattered across the floor were long, deep scratches, gouged into the cheap linoleum like claw marks. They trailed from the bed to the window, and then stopped abruptly, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. "Hello," I called out, though my voice was barely above a whisper. No answer. I inched closer to the window, the flashlight beam trembling as I moved. Outside, the mist hung low, swirling unnaturally in slow, deliberate patterns. It wasn't just mist. It was something alive, watching, waiting. And then I heard it, a low growl, guttural and wet, coming from behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the dim room. At first, I saw nothing, only the flickering lamp and the empty bed. But then, in the corner near the door, a shadow began to move. At first, it looked like an ordinary shadow cast by the flickering light, but then it stepped out of the wall. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form hunched and distorted. Its limbs were too long, its hands ending in claws that glistened like wet obsidian. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. And then it smiled, not with lips or teeth, but with a slow, jagged rip across where its face should have been, a grin that stretched too far, splitting its form like cracked porcelain. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the bed and falling hard onto the floor. My flashlight rolled away, leaving me in near darkness. The creature moved closer, its clawed feet scraping against the floor, each step echoing louder than it should in the tiny room. "Please," I managed to choke out, my back pressed against the nightstand. My hand scrambled for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing, just an old motel phone and a Gideon Bible shoved in the drawer. The creature paused, its head tilting as if it were listening for something, and then it spoke. "Why did you come here?" Its voice was a chorus of whispers, layered and overlapping, each word dripping with malice. I work here," I stammered. It laughed, a sound that made my ears ache and my stomach churn. Not for long. Before I could react, it lunged forward, its claws slicing through the air. But just as it reached me, the room was suddenly bathed in a brilliant light, so bright I had to shield my eyes. When I opened them, the creature was gone. The room was as it had been before, quiet, untouched. The window closed. Even the claw marks on the floor had disappeared. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and bolted from room 13, slamming the door behind me. Back in the safety of the lobby, I locked every door and called the police. They arrived within 20 minutes, But when I tried to explain what had happened, they gave me skeptical looks and insisted there was no sign of forced entry or any disturbance. Room 13 was empty when they checked, save for the faint smell of something burnt lingering in the air. After they left, I decided to check the security footage. The hallway outside room 13 was empty the entire time, except for one thing. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the door opened on its own, and that was when I saw it, just for a second, a shadow, flickering at the edge of the frame, before it disappeared entirely. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. For the next few nights, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air in the motel seemed heavier, and the shadows lingered longer than they should. I avoided room 13 entirely, refusing to even walk down that hallway unless it was absolutely necessary. It was a Tuesday night, 3 days after the incident, when things took another turn. The motel was almost deserted, with only one guest staying in room 6. His name was Marcus, a young college kid traveling cross-country. He'd checked in earlier that evening, cheerful and full of energy, mentioning something about heading to Seattle to visit friends. The clock struck 11:19 p.m. when I first noticed it. The phone on the desk buzzed with an incoming call, and the caller ID showed it was coming from room 13. My stomach dropped. I stared at the phone, willing it to stop ringing, but it didn't. It just kept going, each chime slicing through the silence of the lobby. After a long hesitation, I finally picked up. "Hello," I said, my voice shaky. There was no response at first, just static, but then faintly I heard it. "You left the door open." My heart raced. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. This time, the voice was clearer. "It's not what I want. It's what he wants." Before I could say anything else, the line went dead. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. My first instinct was to grab my car keys and leave, but guilt gnawed at me. What about Marcus? He was still in room 6. I couldn't just leave him here without warning him. I pulled up the security camera feed, my eyes scanning the hallway outside room 13. The door was closed just as I'd left it, but something felt off, and then I saw it. The shadow. It was there again, faint but unmistakable, lingering just outside room 13. It didn't move. It simply stood there, as if waiting for something or someone. I picked up the motel's landline and dialed Marcus's room. He answered after the second ring, his voice groggy. "Yeah," he mumbled. "Marcus, listen to me carefully," I said, my voice urgent. "Lock your door. Don't come out for any reason, okay?" What's going on?" he asked, suddenly more awake. "Just trust me. Please." There was a pause, and then he said, "Okay, but who's knocking on my door?" My blood froze. "Don't answer it," I said quickly. "Whatever you do, don't open that door. Ethan, what the hell is going on?" Marcus whispered, panic creeping into his voice. I could hear it now too, the faint, deliberate knock on his door. "Stay away from the door, Marcus," I urged. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and then it stopped. "Marcus," I called out. There was no answer. "Marcus, are you there?" The line went silent, and then I heard the sound of the receiver hitting the floor, followed by a loud crash. I grabbed the flashlight and bolted out of the lobby, sprinting down the hallway toward room 6. As I reached his door, I noticed it was slightly ajar, just like room 13 had been. "Marcus," I called out, stepping inside. The room was a mess. The nightstand was overturned. The lamp shattered on the floor. The bed was empty. The sheets rumpled as if someone had left in a hurry. And then I saw it. Claw marks etched deep into the wall, trailing from the bed to the window, which was wide open. Outside, the mist had returned, thicker than ever, swirling unnaturally just beyond the window. I scanned the room, my flashlight trembling in my hand, when I noticed something on the carpet near the bed. A single footprint, wet and clawed, leading out the door. I followed it, my heart pounding in my chest, until it led me to the hallway outside room 13. The door was wide open now, and inside, the pale light was back, spilling out into the corridor. And then, from inside the room, I heard Marcus scream. I froze, the sound of Marcus's scream slicing through the silence like a knife. It wasn't just a scream of fear, it was agony, raw and primal, the kind that made my stomach churn. The door to room 13 stood wide open, the pale light spilling out in an almost unnatural glow. The air felt heavy, colder than before, and my legs trembled as I approached. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to run, but I couldn't. Marcus was in there. "Marcus?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I stepped closer, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The beam of light trembled as it illuminated the doorway, revealing more of the room. The furniture was the same as before, bed, nightstand, lamp. But the claw marks were back, deep and jagged, slashing across the walls and floor. And then I saw him. Marcus was standing in the far corner of the room, facing the wall. His back was to me, his body unnaturally still. His head hung low, and his arms dangled at his sides, limp. "Marcus?" I said again, my voice shaking. He didn't move. I took a step inside, the floor creaking beneath my weight. The pale light seemed to pulse, casting shifting shadows across the walls. As I got closer, I noticed something was wrong with him. His shirt was torn and dark, wet stains spread across the fabric. His breathing was shallow, raspy, as if each breath were a struggle. "Hey, buddy, let's get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but before I could, he spoke. "Don't," he whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. I froze. "What happened? Are you hurt?" I asked, stepping closer. "They're watching," he said, his voice trembling. "Who's watching?" He didn't answer. Instead, his head tilted slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with terror. Before I could say anything else, a sound came from behind me, a low growl, guttural and wet, the same sound I'd heard 3 nights ago. I spun around, flashlight beam darting across the room. The shadow was back. It stood near the doorway, taller than before, its form twisted and shifting as if it couldn't quite hold its shape. Its hollow eyes locked onto me, and that jagged, unnatural smile split across its face again. I stumbled back, my flashlight dropping to the floor and rolling away. The room plunged into near darkness, save for the pale, unnatural light. "Run," Marcus whispered behind me. But before I could move, the shadow lunged forward. It moved impossibly fast, its claws slicing through the air. I dove to the side, crashing into the nightstand. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and aiming it toward the shadow. The beam of light seemed to slow it down, its form flickering and retreating slightly. I seized the moment, grabbing Marcus by the arm. "We have to go," I shouted. To my relief, he moved, stumbling after me, as we bolted out of the room. The hallway stretched out before us, but the air was different now, thicker, darker, as if the motel itself had come alive. Behind us, the growling grew louder, echoing down the corridor. We reached the lobby, and I slammed the door shut behind us, locking it. Marcus collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, while I grabbed the phone to call the police. But the line was dead. Outside, the mist pressed against the windows, swirling and writhing like it was alive. The neon motel sign flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. "Ethan," Marcus said, his voice weak. I turned to him, and my blood ran cold. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were different now, darker. "They're not going to let us leave," he whispered. And then, from somewhere deep within the motel, I heard the bell above the front door jingle. The bell's soft jingle echoed through the lobby, impossibly loud in the suffocating silence. I froze, my grip tightening on the flashlight as I stared at the front door. It was still locked, the deadbolt in place, but the bell had definitely rung. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Marcus nodded weakly, his body trembling where he sat on the floor. His eyes darted toward the door, wide with fear. "It's here," he murmured. I didn't want to ask what it was. I already had a sinking feeling I knew. The mist outside pressed harder against the windows, swirling faster now, almost frantic. And then, slowly, the front door began to rattle. "No," I muttered, backing away. The deadbolt shook violently as though someone, or something, was trying to force its way inside. The bell jingled again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Marcus struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the counter. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice cracking. "We have to go, now." I wanted to agree, but where would we go? The parking lot was swallowed by the mist, and the highway beyond it might as well have been another dimension. But staying wasn't an option either. "Back door," I said, pointing toward the staff-only exit at the far end of the lobby. "We can make a run for it." Marcus nodded, and we moved together toward the door. Each step felt heavier, the air thick and oppressive, like trying to wade through water. As I fumbled with the keys to unlock the back door, I heard it again, the growling. But this time, it wasn't just coming from the front. It was everywhere. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, creeping along the walls and ceiling, their twisted forms writhing and shifting in the flickering light. "Hurry," Marcus hissed, his voice shaking. The lock clicked, and I yanked the door open. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and pine. Beyond the doorway was nothing but darkness and mist. We didn't have a choice. Grabbing Marcus by the arm, I pulled him through the door and into the night. The mist enveloped us immediately, so thick I couldn't see more than a foot ahead. The motel's lights disappeared behind us, swallowed by the fog. "Keep moving," I urged, though I wasn't sure which direction to go. The growling was closer now, surrounding us. And then, the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoed through the mist. "Ethan," Marcus whispered, clutching my arm tightly. "They're here." I turned, and through the swirling fog I saw them. Figures, tall, hunched, and impossibly thin, emerged from the darkness. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, and their jagged smiles seemed to stretch wider with every step they took. "Run," I shouted, shoving Marcus forward. We sprinted blindly into the mist. the cold air burning in my lungs. The ground beneath us felt uneven, shifting with each step as though the earth itself were alive. Behind us, the figures moved faster, their growls blending into a chorus of whispers that filled the air. "We're not going to make it," Marcus cried, stumbling. "Yes, we are," I shouted, grabbing his arm to steady him. And then, just ahead, I saw it, a faint light, flickering through the mist. It was small, barely visible, but it was there. "This way," I yelled, dragging Marcus toward it. The light grew brighter as we approached, revealing the outline of an old, rusted fence. Beyond it was a cabin, small and dilapidated, but it looked solid. We reached the fence, scrambling over it as the figures closed in. Their growls were deafening now, their twisted forms barely a few feet away. I slammed the cabin door shut behind us, bolting it with trembling hands. The inside was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of rot. But we were alive for now. Marcus collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. I leaned against the door, clutching the flashlight tightly, my heart pounding in my chest. The growling outside had stopped, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was worse. "What now?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could answer, a voice came from the darkness of the cabin. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice sent chills down my spine. It was low, gravelly, and seemed to reverberate through the walls of the cabin. Marcus and I froze, our breath shallow, as we turned toward the source of the sound. From the far corner of the cabin, a figure stepped into the faint light of my flashlight. It was an old man, hunched and gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glimmer faintly in the darkness. His skin was ashen, his clothes tattered, and his movements unnervingly slow. How long have you been here?" I stammered, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The old man tilted his head, his thin lips curling into a grimace. "Long enough to know you've made a mistake," he said. "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, his voice shaky. The old man took a step closer, his movements deliberate, his gaze never leaving us. "You brought it with you," he said. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. He gestured toward the door. "The thing you ran from. It's not out there anymore. It's in here now." My blood ran cold. I glanced at Marcus, who looked as terrified as I felt. "That's not possible," I said, shaking my head. "We locked the door." You think a lock can stop something like that?" The old man interrupted, his voice rising. "You don't know what you're dealing with." The air in the cabin grew colder, and the dim light of my flashlight began to flicker. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. The old man took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. "There's only one way to survive this," he said. "What is it?" Marcus asked desperately. The old man's expression darkened. "You have to give it what it wants." I frowned. "What does it want?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting between Marcus and me. "It wants you. One of you," he said finally. "What the hell are you talking about?" I snapped, my voice rising. The old man pointed at the door. "It doesn't leave until it takes someone. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked." "No," Marcus said, shaking his head. "We're not doing that. We're not giving it anyone." The old man let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You think you have a choice?" Before I could respond, a loud thud echoed through the cabin. The door rattled violently, and the growling started again, low, guttural, and closer than ever. "They're here," the old man said grimly. The flashlight flickered again, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift, moving on their own. "We have to go," Marcus said, pulling at my arm. "There's nowhere to go," the old man said. "Not unless you're ready to make a sacrifice." The growling grew louder, and the door creaked as though something heavy was pressing against it. "What do we do?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. The old man stepped back into the shadows, his voice a whisper now. "Choose." The door slammed open, and the cold, swirling mist poured in, bringing with it the dark, twisted figures. The mist seeped into the cabin like a living thing, curling along the floor and climbing up the walls. The figures followed, tall, shadowy, and distorted. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, their jagged smiles widening as they entered. I stepped back, instinctively pulling Marcus with me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced for an escape. But the old man's words echoed in my head. Asterisk choose. Asterisk. The figures stopped just inside the doorway, their growls reverberating through the small cabin. The lead shadow, taller and more defined than the others, raised a clawed hand and pointed directly at us. Marcus gripped my arm tightly, his face pale. "What do they want from us?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer. "They want one of us," I said, my voice trembling. The old man stepped out of the shadows again, his expression unreadable. "They're waiting," he said softly. "If you don't choose, they'll take you both, and they'll take their time doing it." "No," Marcus said firmly, shaking his head. "There has to be another way. We can fight them, or—" "There's no fighting them," the old man interrupted. "You're wasting time." The lead shadow took another step forward, its form becoming clearer. Its claws gleamed in the dim light, and its smile seemed impossibly wide now, full of sharp, jagged teeth. "Marcus," I said, my voice breaking. "No," he said again, stepping in front of me. "If someone's going to face them, it's me. You don't deserve this, Ethan." "Stop it," I shouted, grabbing his arm. "We're not doing this. We'll figure something out. We'll..." The growling rose to a deafening roar, and the shadow lunged toward us. I shoved Marcus aside, raising the flashlight instinctively. The beam struck the shadow, and it recoiled, its form flickering and breaking apart like smoke. "It's afraid of the light," I shouted, gripping the flashlight tighter. But the moment of hope was fleeting. The flashlight flickered, and the shadows surged forward, their growls echoing through the cabin. The old man laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "It won't be enough," he said. "You can't stop them." Desperation took over. I turned to Marcus. "Run. Get out of here. I'll hold them off." He hesitated, his face torn with emotion. "I can't leave you, Ethan." "Go," I shouted, shoving him toward the back door. Before he could argue, the lead shadow lunged again, its claws slashing through the air. I ducked, barely avoiding the strike, and swung the flashlight wildly, trying to keep them at bay. Marcus bolted for the back door, but as he reached it, the mist thickened, blocking his path. He stumbled, coughing as the cold air filled his lungs. "They won't let you go," the old man said, his voice grim. "Not until they get what they want." "Shut up," I yelled, turning the flashlight toward him. But he was gone. The corner where he'd been standing was empty, and the shadows were closing in. Marcus looked back at me, his eyes filled with terror. "Ethan..." The lead shadow raised its clawed hand again, pointing at me. Its jagged smile stretched wider, and for the first time, it spoke. Choose, it hissed, its voice like the scraping of metal. The word, *choose*, hung in the air, venomous and final. The lead shadow loomed closer, its form solidifying with every passing second. Its glowing, hollow eyes locked onto mine, unrelenting. Marcus stood frozen near the back door, his chest heaving, the mist swirling around him. He looked at me, his lips trembling as if trying to form words. "I can't," I whispered, my voice cracking. My hands trembled so violently that the flashlight beam danced erratically across the cabin. "I can't do this." The shadow tilted its head, almost mockingly, and took another step forward. Its companions crept closer too, their twisted forms writhing in anticipation. The old man's voice seemed to echo in my head, even though he was nowhere to be seen. If you don't choose, they'll take you both slowly. Marcus finally spoke, his voice trembling but firm. "It's me," he said. "Take me." "No," I shouted, spinning toward him. "Don't you dare. You have a family, Ethan," Marcus said, tears streaming down his face. "You have people who care about you. You don't deserve to die here like this." "And you do," I shot back, my voice breaking. The lead shadow growled low, impatient, and raised one clawed hand toward Marcus. "Stop," I screamed, stepping between them. My heart raced, and my chest felt like it was caving in. "Take me." "Leave him alone." The shadow paused, its jagged smile stretching wider as if it was pleased. "No," Marcus said, grabbing my arm and trying to pull me back. "I won't let you do this." "I won't let you do it either," I yelled, tears burning in my eyes. The growling rose to a deafening pitch, and the shadows began to swarm, circling us like vultures. The flashlight flickered again, its beam growing weaker. "Please," Marcus begged, his voice breaking. "You have so much to live for, Ethan." "So do you," I shot back. The lead shadow hissed, its voice like a blade, scraping against stone. "Choose now." I turned to Marcus, my chest tightening. "We'll both fight. Together." But before I could move, Marcus shoved me backward, hard. I stumbled and fell, hitting the floor with a thud. "Marcus, no!" I screamed, scrambling to my feet. He turned to face the shadow, his expression resolute. "If this is the only way, then fine. Take me." The shadows surged forward, engulfing him in an instant. His scream tore through the cabin, raw and filled with unimaginable pain. "Marcus," I shouted, rushing toward him, but the mist thickened, forming an impenetrable wall between us. His screams faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The shadows retreated slowly, their forms dissolving into the mist. And then they were gone. The cabin fell deathly quiet, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. The flashlight flickered one last time before going out completely, leaving me in darkness. "Marcus?" I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no response. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of my own ragged breathing. My flashlight was dead now, leaving me alone in the pitch-black void. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, praying it still had enough battery to light the room. When the screen finally lit up, its pale glow revealed only emptiness. Marcus was gone. The old man was gone. Even the mist had retreated, leaving behind a stillness that felt far more menacing than the chaos before. "Marcus?" I called again, my voice small and hollow. Nothing. I stumbled toward the spot where he'd stood just moments ago. The floor was cold and damp beneath my hands as I searched blindly for any trace of him. But there was nothing, no blood, no footprints, no sign that he had ever been there at all. Tears stung my eyes, and a lump rose in my throat. I slammed my fists against the floor, a raw scream tearing from my chest. He was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, paralyzed by the weight of what had just happened. The shadows, the mist, the impossible horror. It all seemed unreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But the emptiness where Marcus had been was all too real. The faint sound of creaking would snap me out of my daze. My head whipped around, the phone's light darting across the room. At first, I saw nothing. But then, in the far corner of the cabin, a figure emerged from the shadows. "Marcus," I whispered, my heart leaping with hope. But as the figure stepped into the light, I realized it wasn't him. It was the old man. "You," I snarled, rising to my feet. "What did you do? Where is he?" The old man's face was ashen, his eyes sunken and tired. "It wasn't me," he said quietly. "You knew the price, and so did he." I took a step toward him, my fists clenched. "Bring him back." "I can't," he said, shaking his head. "Once they take someone, they're gone." "No," I growled, shaking my head. "You're lying. There has to be a way." "There isn't," he interrupted, his voice firm. "You're lucky to be alive, boy. Take that luck and leave while you still can." "I'm not leaving without him," I said, my voice trembling with anger and despair. The old man sighed, his gaze dropping to the floor. "You think you're the first to try and fight them? You think you're the first to lose someone?" I stepped closer, my phone's light casting long shadows across the room. "Then help me," I said, desperation bleeding into my voice. "If you've seen this before, you must know something. Anything." He hesitated, his expression conflicted. "There's a way," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not what you think." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. He looked up at me, his eyes cold and haunted. "The only way to bring someone back is to go where they've been taken. And trust me, boy, you don't want to go there." The air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows on the walls seemed to shift, as if they were listening. "What is it?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. "Where did they take him?" The old man took a deep breath, his gaze piercing. "They took him beyond the veil, to their world. If you go after him, you might not come back. And even if you do, you won't be the same." I clenched my jaw, my mind racing. "Tell me how to get there." The old man shook his head. "You don't understand. That place, it's not meant for the living. It'll tear you apart." "I don't care," I said, my voice firm. "He sacrificed himself for me. I'm not leaving him there." The old man studied me for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "If that's your choice, then so be it. But don't say I didn't warn you." He reached into his tattered coat and pulled out a small, silver key. It was old and tarnished, with strange, intricate symbols carved into its surface. "This will open the door," he said, holding it out to me. "But once you step through, there's no turning back." I took the key, its cold metal biting into my palm. "What do I do?" I asked. He pointed toward the far wall of the cabin, where a faint outline of a door was beginning to form in the wood. The mist crept back in, swirling around the edges of the door frame like a living thing. "Turn the key," he said, and pray that you're ready for what's on the other side. The key felt heavier in my hand than it should have, as though it carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. The faint outline of the door on the far wall seemed to pulse, the mist around it shifting like tendrils beckoning me forward. I glanced back at the old man. His expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "If you step through that door," he said quietly, "you won't come back the same. If you come back at all." "I have to try," I said, my voice firm despite the fear clawing at my insides. He nodded slowly, stepping back into the shadows. "Then go. And remember, what you see in their world isn't real, but it will feel real. Don't let it break you." I turned toward the door, my heart pounding. The closer I got, the colder the air became. The mist thickened, wrapping around my legs like icy chains. I stopped just in front of the faint outline, the key trembling in my hand. Taking a deep breath, I reached out and inserted the key into an invisible lock. The moment it clicked into place, the door's outline grew brighter, glowing with an eerie blue light. The mist surged, swirling violently around me as the door creaked open. Beyond the threshold was darkness, deep, endless, and alive. The air felt heavier, charged with an unnatural energy that made my skin crawl. "Ethan," the old man called out one last time, "don't lose yourself in there. No one else will save you." I didn't respond. My grip tightened on the key as I stepped through the doorway. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. It felt like I was falling, though my feet were still on solid ground. The darkness enveloped me, pressing against my chest, my mind, my very soul. And then, with a sudden jolt, I was standing in a place I couldn't comprehend. The landscape was a twisted reflection of the world I knew. Trees stood gnarled and blackened, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward a sky that pulsed with an unnatural red glow. The ground beneath me was uneven and cracked, oozing a dark, viscous liquid. A low, guttural hum filled the air, resonating in my bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a reminder that I was somewhere I didn't belong. "Marcus," I called out, my voice echoing unnaturally. The only response was the hum, which grew louder, more oppressive. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, darting between the twisted trees. I took a step forward, and the ground squelched beneath my feet. The air was thick and cold, each breath burning in my lungs. "Marcus," I called again, desperation creeping into my voice. This time, there was a sound, a faint, distant cry. "Ethan," it was his voice, weak and trembling but unmistakable. I turned toward the sound, my heart leaping with hope. "Marcus, where are you? Help me." The voice was closer now, coming from somewhere deeper in the twisted forest. I broke into a run, ignoring the unnatural terrain beneath my feet. The shadows seemed to move with me, whispering incomprehensible words that scratched at the edges of my mind. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the red glow of the sky. The darkness deepened, but I pressed on, following Marcus's voice. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing, and my breath caught in my throat. Marcus was there, but he was trapped. Thick, black tendrils coiled around his body, pulling him toward a gaping void in the ground. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror as he struggled against the unrelenting force. "Ethan!" he screamed, his voice raw. "I'm here," I shouted, rushing toward him. But as I reached for him, the shadows surged forward, forming a barrier between us. The tendrils tightened their grip, dragging him closer to the void. "Let him go," I yelled, swinging the flashlight wildly. Its beam cut through the darkness, but it had no effect here. A low, rumbling laugh echoed through the clearing, chilling me to the bone. "You do not belong here," a voice growled, deep and guttural. "Neither does he," I shouted, my voice defiant despite the fear threatening to consume me. The shadows writhed, their movements growing more erratic. The tendrils began to pull Marcus faster, and his screams grew louder. "Please, Ethan," he cried. "Don't let it take me." I lunged forward, reaching for his hand, but the darkness pushed me back. "You cannot save him," the voice said, its tone mocking. "You can only join him." The word struck me like a physical blow. The shadows closed in tighter, twisting and writhing around me. My hand reached out, desperately trying to grab hold of Marcus, but it was useless. The air was thick with an oppressive force, as if the very world itself was rejecting me. "Ethan," Marcus screamed again, his face contorted in pain as the tendrils dragged him closer to the void. The darkness in the center of the clearing was a black hole that seemed to consume everything around it, and the closer Marcus got, the more his body twisted in unnatural ways, as though the void itself was shaping him into something else. I couldn't let this happen. With a surge of panic and adrenaline, I tried to push through the shadows, ignoring the way they coiled around my limbs, trying to pull me down as well. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tightening with each step I took toward Marcus. "You can't have him," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Not like this." But as I moved closer, the shadows grew stronger, harder to resist. They latched onto me, tugging at my body as though they were trying to drag me into the same fate Marcus was facing. The ground beneath me seemed to give way, and I stumbled, nearly falling into the same void that threatened to swallow him whole. "Ethan, help me." Marcus's voice was barely audible now, fading as the darkness began to consume him entirely. His eyes, wide with terror, were the last thing I saw before a blinding light erupted from the center of the void. I shielded my eyes, staggering back as the light intensified. It was so bright that it cut through the shadows, pushing them away, forcing them to retreat. For a moment, the clearing was bathed in pure white light. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished, and with it the shadows. I blinked, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The clearing was empty. Marcus was gone. The tendrils, the void, the whispers, everything was gone. The place I had come to rescue him from seemed to collapse in on itself, disintegrating into nothingness. I was alone. The air felt less oppressive now, the weight lifting slightly from my chest. But the relief didn't last. It was quickly replaced by the crushing realization that I had failed. I had come to save Marcus, and now I was the only one left. The silence that followed was deafening. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, paralyzed, unable to process the loss. But then, just as I was about to collapse under the weight of my grief, I heard it. A faint, soft whisper. It came from the direction of the clearing's edge, just beyond where the void had been. "Ethan," I froze. It was Marcus's voice, but it didn't sound like him. It was distant, hollow, as if it came from the very air itself. "Marcus," I whispered, my voice trembling. The whisper came again, louder this time. Ethan, I'm sorry. I turned toward the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. Marcus? But there was nothing, only the darkness, still thick with the scent of decay. I took a step forward, my pulse quickening, but then I heard the laughter. It wasn't Marcus's. It was something else, something dark, something ancient. The ground began to tremble beneath my feet, and the shadows reappeared, swirling around me like a storm. Ethan, the voice again, but now it was a mixture of Marcus's and something else, something far more sinister. I turned to run, but the mist rose up around me, blocking my path. The laughter grew louder, and the shadows pressed in from all sides. Join him, the voice hissed. Join him in the darkness. Suddenly, I felt the tendrils wrap around my ankles, pulling me back toward the center of the clearing. No, I screamed, fighting with every ounce of strength I had. But the darkness was stronger than anything I could resist. The last thing I saw before the world went black was Marcus's face, twisted and distorted, emerging from the shadows. His eyes, once filled with fear, were now empty, hollow, reflecting nothing but the darkness itself, and then there was nothing. The void swallowed me whole. The last remnants of light disappeared, leaving me in an endless black. Time lost all meaning here. It was as if I had ceased to exist in any tangible way, a ghost caught between worlds. My mind was hazy, struggling to understand what had happened, but all I could feel was a hollow emptiness where once there was life. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Every part of me was suspended in this unnatural stillness, as though I were trapped in a dream I couldn't wake up from. My thoughts flickered like dying embers, and I could feel someone watching me. Then, out of the blackness came a whisper. Ethan. The voice was faint at first, like a distant memory, but it grew clearer, more distinct. It was Marcus. Marcus? My voice was weak, as if it were struggling to break free from the silence around me. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice tinged with sorrow. I didn't want you to come here. I didn't want this for you. Tears stung my eyes, but I couldn't see anything in this endless void. Where are you? I cried out. What happened to you? What is this place? The voice trembled with fear. This is their world. The place beyond, the veil. I felt a sharp, cold sensation run through me as the air seemed to shift. My thoughts grew fragmented, and I heard the low hum again, resonating in the very core of my being. Marcus, I whispered, hoping for any sign, any clue that he was still here with me. Please tell me how to get out. I can't be here. I don't belong here. The voice responded, but now it was strained. You don't belong here, but you're here because you wanted to save me. I could feel the sorrow in his words. And now you'll never leave. Not truly. No, I gasped, my heart pounding with dread. You don't understand. I can't stay here, Marcus. I won't. The laughter came again, sharp and taunting, from all directions. It wasn't Marcus anymore. It was something else, something ancient and mocking. The air thickened around me, the weight of the darkness pressing down until I could barely breathe. The ground beneath me seemed to churn, shifting like something alive, and the echoes of footsteps, slow, deliberate, surrounded me. The shadows began to move, twisting and writhing, and the laughter intensified, as if the very darkness were alive. I could feel them closing in, the figures from before, those twisted, distorted beings. Their glowing eyes gleamed in the black, and their skeletal hands reached toward me, asterisk choose asterisk. The word asterisk choose asterisk bore down on me again, cold and commanding. My heart raced. I had heard this before. The price, the sacrifice. I tried to pull away, but the darkness held me in place. My limbs were heavy, as though they no longer obeyed me. The shadows grew closer, their presence suffocating. The hollow laughter filled my ears, drowning out everything else. "I'm sorry, Ethan," Marcus's voice whispered one last time. But this time it wasn't filled with fear, it was calm. "This is your fate. You can't escape it." And then I saw them. The figures, those shadows that had tormented me, moved into my vision, their elongated bodies flickering with an unnatural energy, their eyes locked on mine, gleaming with malice and hunger. They had no faces, no features, just an empty void that seemed to swallow everything they touched. I had only one choice. I could feel it. The darkness was pulling me in, urging me toward them, toward the inevitable. I closed my eyes, preparing myself for what was to come. But then, in the silence, something unexpected happened. A soft glow appeared in the distance. It was faint at first, a small flicker of light that grew brighter as it approached. I squinted, confused, and the figure that emerged from the light made my heart skip a beat. It was Marcus, his form, but different. He was no longer trapped in the void, no longer distorted by the shadows. He was whole, his face calm, serene, but there was something unmistakably wrong about the way he appeared. He stepped closer, his feet barely touching the ground. His eyes, once filled with fear and confusion, now reflected only an empty sadness. "You're not alone here, Ethan," Marcus said softly, his voice no longer trembling with desperation. It was as though he had become one with this place. "This is where the lost belong, where they are bound forever." The glow surrounding him dimmed slightly, and the shadows behind me began to stir again. "Marcus," I whispered, reaching out, but it was too late. The darkness swallowed him whole, and in his place, only the faint echo of his voice remained. And then everything went dark again. The darkness pressed in around me once more, suffocating and relentless. I felt myself falling, or perhaps it was the world itself that was falling away, unraveling like threads slipping through the hands of a desperate seamstress. My chest tightened, the air thin and cold, the weight of eternity bearing down on me. I stood still, or perhaps I was moving. I couldn't tell anymore. Time had lost its meaning in this void, and the once familiar sensation of fear had begun to warp into something else, something far worse. Despair. "Marcus," I whispered again, my voice breaking in the silence. "Please, help me." But there was no response, only the oppressive quiet. The air seemed thick with something unseen, a presence watching me, waiting for me to surrender. The weight of the darkness was almost physical now, a heavy hand pressing down on my shoulders, dragging me further into its grasp. The last words he had spoken echoed in my mind, each syllable a cold reminder of my fate. "Where the lost belong, bound forever." Bound forever. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was trapped. I had come to this place to save Marcus, but in doing so, I had sealed my own fate. This was not just a place of shadows and whispers. This was where the lost souls went, where they were chained to this dark world, forgotten by time. And I was no different now. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet gave way. I fell, not into an abyss, but into something else entirely, something that felt alive, pulsating with the rhythm of 1,000 hearts. The light that had flickered before was gone, replaced by a suffocating darkness that swallowed every thought, every sense. I didn't know how long I had been falling, but eventually I stopped. Or perhaps it was that I finally realized I had stopped. I was still in the void, but now I could feel something else. The hum was back, faint at first, then growing louder and louder until it seemed to echo in my very bones. The darkness began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, but then faster, swirling around me like a storm gaining strength. "Ethan," the whisper came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just Marcus's voice. It was something more, something ancient. It was the voice of the void itself, deep and resonant, filled with an overwhelming presence. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe, but I could hear. I could feel the presence surrounding me, pushing into my mind, probing my thoughts, like fingers skimming the surface of water. "You're not meant to leave," the voice said, its tone echoing through the dark. "You chose this path, and now you must pay the price." I wanted to scream, to fight, to find some way to break free from the crushing weight of the words. But all I could do was stand there, trapped in this prison of my own making. "You will never be free, Ethan," the voice continued, growing stronger. "Once you step into this world, it takes what it wants, and there's no way out, no way back." The pressure in my chest grew, and I could feel my mind beginning to fray, unraveling like the dark fabric around me. Desperation clawed at me. I thought of Marcus, of everything I had lost, and everything I might still lose, but it was too late. The shadows were closing in again, and this time, they weren't just passing by, they were taking hold. They were shaping me, turning me into something else. Something that didn't belong in the world of the living. "You belong to us now," the voice intoned, and this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. The ground beneath me began to twist and churn, the darkness folding in on itself as if it were alive, pulsating with a twisted rhythm. I could hear distant screams, lost souls, trapped here like I was. Their cries echoed through the void, but I couldn't see them. I couldn't reach them. Suddenly, a sharp, icy pain tore through me. It felt like every nerve in my body was being torn apart, every part of me being pulled in every direction at once. I screamed, but no sound came. I was a hollow shell, trapped in the dark, consumed by something ancient and malevolent. I tried to fight, to push against it, but the shadows closed around me like a cage. The last remnants of my consciousness were slipping away, slipping into the abyss. And then there was nothing. When I opened my eyes again, everything was different. The darkness was still there, but it no longer pressed in on me. I wasn't falling anymore. I was standing, but I wasn't alone. In front of me, the shadows had gathered into something or someone, a figure. At first, it was hard to make out, just a vague shape in the oppressive gloom. But as I focused, the figure grew clearer. It was Marcus. No, not Marcus. Not entirely. He stood there, his body bent and broken, his eyes hollow and empty. But he was smiling. "I told you," he whispered. "This place, it changes you. We're all part of it now." I reached out to him, but my hand passed through his form as though he were made of mist. "You chose this, Ethan, and now you are one of us." His smile twisted into something far darker. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "One of us. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath was shallow, ragged, as I tried to comprehend what was happening. This couldn't be real. I had come here to save Marcus, to save us both. And yet, here I stood in this nightmare world, facing what could only be described as a twisted version of him, something broken and lost to this dark place. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "This can't be happening. You're not Marcus. You can't be." But the figure before me only smiled, the shadows around him swirling like smoke. "I told you, Ethan, there's no escape once you step into the void. You're mine now, and this world is ours." I felt the chill of the void closing in once more. The tendrils of darkness reached toward me, wrapping around my legs, pulling me toward the ground. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I was drowning in the very air around me. Marcus's face flickered with a cruel smile as the shadows began to engulf me. "You've been here long enough to know the truth. Once the veil is lifted, you're never the same. This place, it takes everything, even your soul." I reached out to him again, but my hand passed through his form like vapor. His hollow eyes stared back at me, devoid of the warmth they once held. This wasn't him. Not anymore. "No, I won't let this happen. I'll fight. I'll escape," I screamed. But the more I struggled, the tighter the darkness gripped me. The laughter echoed, deep and unnerving. It came from everywhere, from Marcus, from the shadows, from the world itself. There was no escape. I had fallen too far. I had lost myself in the very place I had tried to save him from. The last thing I saw before the darkness closed in completely was his face, twisted and human, and yet somehow still wearing that faint, mocking smile. And then there was nothing. Asterisk, you thought you could escape. You thought you could save him, asterisk. The voice echoed in my mind, as cold and distant as the shadows. But there is no escape. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the depths of the unknown. If you want to hear more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to subscribe. There's always something lurking in the darkness, and I'll be here, waiting to guide you through it. Until next time,